Margaret Levy, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, which is where you are. And I would usually give a little spiel about the center, which is over 60 years old and has been the most important social science research institute by some claims for all that time, and has produced numerous major research programs and scholars. But I won't go on about it because I have several other things to introduce. We have these seminar series approximately 3 times a year in order to introduce a wider group of people to our fellows and some of the work that they are doing, and that's what you're here to do tonight. But this is a very special lecture for a couple of reasons. The most important is this is the inaugural Robert A. Scott lecture. This is Robert A. Scott. You want to stand, Bob, so we can... And those of you who don't know him, I will now give you the reasons why you clapped. Okay? Bob celebrated a milestone birthday not very long ago. And knowing this, one of the former fellows, Miles Houston, led an effort that we at CASBS enthusiastically supported with help and with money, inviting CASBS former fellows to establish this lectureship fund. Why did we want to honor Bob? Bob is a legendary and much-loved figure in the history of the center. He was the associate director for 18 years, from 1983 to 2001. He stepped up again and served as associate director, acting associate director, in 2009 to 2010, when Iris Litt was the director. Bob worked tirelessly organizing incoming classes. He selflessly, and I was one of those fellows he organized into the place, and then selflessly helped us solve our problems, whether trivial or large, whether professional or personal. One of his biggest claims to fame was arranging a daily volleyball game, which itself spawned more than a few collaborations. There was some competition about reviving the volleyball court and naming that and naming a lectureship, but the lectureship went out. Also joining us tonight is Julia Friedman, Bob's wife of many, many years now, and a great friend of the center as well. Thank you, Bob and Julia, for continuing to be such good friends of the center and such important parts of the CASBS community. The other reason this is a special symposium is it's co-hosted tonight, a new innovation that we're introducing. So this is, I believe, our first seriously co-hosted symposium. And it's co-hosted with the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, with which we are in the process of developing an ongoing partnership and relationship. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Fields, who some of you know is sitting in the front row here. You can also stand. We can also clap you. Chris is the Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute, Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies, Professor, School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences, and a senior fellow at the Precourt Institute for Energy. See, I had to read all that. I mean, and I'm also going to read the little thing that the Woods Institute writes up about itself, though I think it's a splendid organization that's doing really, really important work on climate change and the environment. It's the university's hub of interdisciplinary environment and sustainability research. It's the go-to place for Stanford faculty, researchers, and students to collaborate on environmental and climate change research. Their interdisciplinary work crosses sectors and disciplines, advancing solutions to the most critical, complex environmental and sustainability issues. It's pursuing breakthrough solutions that link knowledge to action and solve the environmental challenges of today and tomorrow. But it recognized that it needs social science to help with that problem, with those problems, not just climate change scientists and lawyers. So we are trying to help with that. Now let me introduce tonight's speaker. You all have some info about Eric Klinenberg, but let me elaborate. Eric is a master of all, and that's an intended pun, which he caught, which has to do with his co-author, Aziz Ansari, the master of none. Right? Eric writes deep and serious social science. He also writes thoughtful, research-informed, and highly readable work on climate change. He writes for such outlets as Wired, which you have, I think, on your seat, the article that just came out in Wired in a special issue that was edited by a man named Barack Obama. It's a very exciting piece. He's also written for The New Yorker. He has a best-selling book with Aziz Ansari, A Modern Romance, which is not on climate change, but is on relationships. And he is someone who has been studying social networks, relationships, and the way in which they form, and that's a large part of what's informing his work that you will hear tonight. Eric is an inspired and dedicated administrator, teacher, and parent, as well as writer. And I understand he plays a mean game of tennis, or at least intends to play a mean game of tennis. We are thrilled at CASBS to have him here as a returning fellow. We're especially delighted that he is here to advance his important work on the social life of climate change, and in the process advance the deepening collaboration between the Woods Institute and CASBS. He's also a Woods Institute fellow this year. And did I say Eric is a terrific speaker? Which you are about to find out.
Thanks. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Margaret. What a nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful night. I've been so nervous all day. I've really been it's been the least productive day of my career, I would say. It has nothing to do with the lecture. It's that I'm a lifelong Cubs fan. I'm not kidding, actually. My father's here. I grew up a few blocks from Wrigley Field. I've been to more than 100 Cubs games there. And we scheduled this lecture, I don't know, 9 months ago. And the idea that this lecture would coincide with the first game the Cubs were in the World Series never occurred to me. But from now on, I will make sure before I book any other commitments that they don't coincide with the World Series. I'm thrilled to be here, but it's a little bit like torture to be talking about climate change right now. I'm just going to put it out there so we can start, in a totally honest way. Thank you very much. Let me be honest. It's an enormous honor for anyone to be here at the center for a year as a scholar. If you haven't been here before and you walked around and you saw what this place is like and you met some of the other fellows, you'll know what an incredible experience it is to be here. It's an honor of another order altogether to be invited to inaugurate the Robert Scott Lecture Series and to start to build this collaboration with the Woods Institute. So whatever happens in the baseball game, it's going to be a good night. But I do want to talk about a somewhat somber and serious topic, although it's not. I don't really have a hopeless message. I have a very different kind of story to tell about climate change and the future of cities. And what I want to say about climate change just at the outset is that if the social sciences were not invented yet, and we were beginning to invent them today, the way that our ancestors did, say 130 years ago, 140 years ago or more, there are all sorts of things that we study now that we would still study, things like labor and inequality and bureaucracy. But we certainly would be studying the climate. as one of the core kind of foundational issues of our time, right? You could not invent 21st century social science and not have our relationship to the ecosystems that make life possible be central to that. And yet we didn't really see that in the 19th century. And so they are kind of peripheral players in the social sciences. And the project that Margaret and I have been working on with Andrew Lakoff, my collaborator, and Jesse Ribot and Deborah Lawrence, who just happened to be here this year, but also work on climate, is to try to really help Stanford become the leader in this initiative. So don't tell my friends at NYU, which pays me most of the time, that's what we're doing, but we really want to build something here. And so we're all part of that conversation. So this is not a chart that you see often in social science lectures, but it's a big chart in climate science lectures. I presume that you've seen a chart that looks something like that before. It shows both the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and also the global temperature in degrees from 1880 to 2000. And the reason that we're really worried these days is because that's a pretty strong relationship that we have between those two lines. As we emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it gets hotter and sea levels rise, and we see a greater incidence of extreme weather events of various kinds. The reason that we're really concerned is not just because of that chart from the past, but also because this is a kind of the future scenarios for what might happen depending on how much we emit in the future, with that red line being a kind of terrifying scenario in which we would be really happy to be here at Casbis on beachfront property. Or, not literally, but I mean, that's a really scary scenario where we have to really remake the places that we've settled in our infrastructures. And the line on the bottom, which while it looks better, is actually a scenario. We do the best we possibly can. It's a scenario in which we still face, decades or longer of continued warming and rising sea levels and a higher incidence of dangerous weather. And what I always say when I lecture on this to students is, if this clicker that I was holding in my hand suddenly became a magic button, and I could press it right now and stop global greenhouse gas emissions this very moment. First of all, that'd be very cool. But also, it would not get rid of the problem that we face, right? Because we baked so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We are reckoning with a lot of climate change, no matter what we do. And so there's no question that mitigation, which is this project of reducing our carbon footprint and our greenhouse gas emissions, by changing the way we get energy and by changing the way we consume things, by changing a lot of daily practices, this is a central challenge, and probably this is the foremost challenge for people who are concerned about the future of our species and many other species. But it's not enough. It's not, there's more to it than that. Already, this is a chart that you can't read, but it's just showing you that there's been a lot of extreme weather events in a lot of different places on Earth very recently, with warmest years and droughts and hurricanes and heat waves that we should be concerned about. We are already at the beginning of serious displacement and forced migrations due to climate stressors. That's 2012. These are kind of scenarios for different zones around the world that are really threatened by the kind of weather and the kind of climate that we're going to see. And for those of you who are following policy debates closely, you will have noticed that just in the last few weeks, President Obama published a new memorandum establishing climate change as a serious problem for U.S. national security. Right. So the Pentagon takes this seriously. The government takes it seriously. It's already affecting the way that we will make federal investments, not just in the issue of mitigation, but also in terms of how we protect ourselves. This is not a national issue only. This is a very local issue for those of us who are here in Stanford. This is just a little map that came out not long ago from a research institute called Climate Central, showing areas that are vulnerable with a 5-foot sea level rise, if there's no adaptation or defensive initiatives. And you'll notice that one of the few areas in the Bay Area that's very vulnerable is here in East Palo Alto, or down the road in East Palo Alto, where there's serious flooding issues. And there's already, I think, a $50 or $60 million project afoot to try to provide some protection. That's the seawall around the Embarcadero. Many of you probably read this in this series of papers or reports that came out in the San Francisco Chronicle earlier this year that started to explain this. I just want you to know that sea level rise is not a non-issue for the Bay Area, even though it feels like drought is really the major stressor of the moment. What I want to talk to you mostly about today is what we're focusing on in this first year of this Casbus Woods project, and that's cities and climate change, with a focus on how cities could adapt or transform in the face of the threats that are coming. And one of the through lines that I want us to be thinking about over the course of the next 40 minutes or so that I speak is this question about adaptation and transformation and inequality. Social scientists think a lot about inequality, which is one of the core concerns that we've held for a long time. And the concern is that, as you'll soon see, there are many things that we can do to protect ourselves and protect our settlements and our structures and our infrastructures from the kind of climate and weather we're going to see. But they're often very, very expensive. And so we have a concept in the world now called environmental injustice, and we use it to refer to people's exposure to different kinds of toxic or dangerous conditions. And what I want to tell you is that this concept of environmental injustice is about to have a resonance and significance that it's never had before. And that if we're not very careful about the way that we adapt and transform, we're going to usher in an age of environmental injustice that will be gravely serious, that will become a global problem with local consequences. So the way that I want to start this, I'm a Cubs fan. I'm going to evince that by taking you on a brief revisit to Chicago, my native city. This is Chicago in 1995. It's the place. This is where I did my dissertation research about a big heat wave. And this is what the city looks like on a hot day. I see some faces of people who spent a lot of time in Chicago here, so I know I'm not the only one who's experienced a hot Chicago summer. It's not just hot, it's also humid. Cities are heat islands. They attract the heat because of the development, the concrete, the asphalt, the steel, and they also trap heat because of pollution. So central cities tend to be hot not just during the day, but also hotter, significantly hotter at night than the outlying areas around them. In July of 1995, the weather was truly unusual in Chicago. The temperature reached 106 degrees. And the heat index, which is like the wind chill, what it feels like, got up to 126. And it stayed like that for about 2.5 to 3 days. The infrastructure in Chicago failed. That's actually pretty predictable these days. We used to think of the United States as being distinctive because you always could rely on the electricity working here. We always could pump water. These days, in most places, it's actually the opposite. If it gets very hot, if the weather gets extreme, we just expect that the infrastructure is going to break down. Hundreds of thousands of people lost power in Chicago because everyone turned on their air conditioning units at the same time. And that means we now know from Sandy, if you're reading those stories closely, when there's no power, you can't pump water up in high-rise buildings above the 5th or 6th or 7th floor. And also in Chicago, there are many neighborhoods where people didn't have air conditioning, and the survival strategy for a heat wave is you open up the fire hydrant. And so lots of neighborhoods found that their water pressure was gone. So it's 126 degrees. You have no power, and you have no water in many parts of the city. The city starts to break down. There are upwards of 50 hospitals in the city of Chicago. More than half of them were on bypass status because so many thousands of people needed emergency care that they all came into to the hospitals around the same time. The city had no real capacity to monitor which hospitals were open and which were closed. And so they started kind of sending ambulances to the next place, but they were driving for 3, 4, 5, 10 miles in some cases to try to find a place where they could take a new patient. This is a really serious situation. It also had to do with the way we think about events that are serious and events that are not serious. Now, I would argue that Chicago would never have reacted that way had it been a hurricane, because when a hurricane is coming into a city, television news programs interrupt their regularly scheduled broadcasts, right? We all become experts on the difference between a category 1 and a category 3. We have these incredible color-coded maps that tell a story about what's coming into us. We don't do that for heat waves, right? That would be kind of wimpy. But the truth is that heat waves in typical years kill more Americans than all of the other so-called natural disasters combined. But they inflict very little property damage. They're not spectacular. And so we don't signal to health officials or to city officials that we need to do something. So we have a social structure in the US, as in many other parts of the world, where when it gets very hot and uncomfortable in the summer, the elites get out of town. Now, this is not a moral indictment. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a preacher. On some days you might not believe that, but I actually am a social scientist. And as an element of social structure, we know that elites leave town. And so the city leaders in Chicago left, the business leaders left. No one realized that the city had developed a heat emergency plan, and no one activated it during this moment of extraordinary crisis. The result was catastrophic. More than 700 people in the city died. Thousands more were hospitalized. It was not an equal opportunity disaster. Very few are. It was especially lethal for older people, for people who were frail, for people who lived alone. And there was this kind of very grisly spectacle of people, so many people dying and being taken away from their homes that they were taken to the morgue. And the city had to bring in refrigerated trucks to handle it. It was really a terrible scene. And it's not just there were specific people that were most likely to perish. There are also particular places in the city that were more vulnerable than others. Now, I presume that in the last few weeks, several of you heard the announcements for the new round of Nobel Prizes that came out. Maybe some of you followed that. I will never win a Nobel Prize for this map here, which shows you that basically the neighborhoods that had high death rates in Chicago were the very poor, primarily African-American neighborhoods on the west sides and the south sides. This is among the most predictable things that could happen in the world. It's kind of commonplace social science. This is just what we know will happen, and clearly that was the case. But when I was doing research on this event, I wasn't very satisfied just by telling a story in which it was poor neighborhoods that suffered the most. I knew there was something else going on. And so I started spending time doing ethnographic observation, very close research in different parts of the city, including neighborhoods that were right next to each other, that looked very similar demographically. On paper, they looked like they were the same kinds of place, very poor, very segregated. But that in fact had very different kinds of outcomes and experiences during the heat wave. I wanted to figure out what was going on. So I found these pairs of neighboring neighborhoods where in advance of the heat wave, you wouldn't have known what would happen. Here's a neighborhood called Englewood on the south side of Chicago, totally African-American, very poor. Here's a neighborhood across the street called Auburn Gresham, also totally African-American, also very poor, also dealing with issues around high violence. It turns out that this neighborhood, Englewood, which looks kind of green in some ways, is not green in a healthy way. It's a neighborhood that was abandoned and depleted and that had lost what I have come to think of as its social infrastructure. The sidewalks, the commercial life, the public areas that draw people out of their homes and into public life, where they might find companionship and get support, where they might be identified as someone who is in trouble by a neighbor and therefore saved. This neighborhood had a death rate during the heat wave that was 10 times higher than this neighborhood, Auburn Gresham, even though demographically they look very similar. You might say brick buildings, you know, those bake like ovens. That can't be a safe place. But if you live in a neighborhood that looks like this, you're just more likely to be drawn into the public realm and to participate in social life, which can be protective. Whereas if you live in a neighborhood like this, you're far more likely to get isolated. And that's especially true if you're older and frail and vulnerable, right? There's a big story about social infrastructure. I came to learn that our hardline infrastructure, our power grids, our transit systems, our water systems, they will break no matter what we do. And in those situations, what makes the difference between life and death is the quality of the social infrastructure. I got the first hints of that in Chicago. This is just a scene weeks after the disaster. Dozens of people were never claimed by friends or family members and were buried together in what looks kind of like a mass grave outside of the city in a suburb. It's very disturbing. It tells us something about the demography, the way we live now. There are more people who are living alone and aging alone than ever before, and they are often extremely vulnerable. And the risk factors we face with climate change aren't just climate risks, they intersect with social risks, and those are the kinds of things we try to understand. And don't worry, if you haven't heard about this great Chicago heat wave before today, you don't have to blame yourself. The city of Chicago never held public hearings on the event. There were no federal hearings. In fact, the major statement that the city issued on this event was this report. And if you're a close reader, you'll know that you'll notice a couple awkward things about this report. It's always been amazing to me that the phrase heat wave is not there. And those of you who are really into kind of deep visual studies will probably also notice the presence of a snowflake on the cover. If you ever wanted to not learn from an event, Chicago made it very easy for you to do that. And that's why in 2003, when a massive heat wave hit Europe for 3 weeks and more than 70,000 people died, political officials across the continent said, nothing like this has ever happened before. How could we have known? There's no way for us to prepare. Right? And so one of the things about the situation that we're in right now is that we really have to learn from what goes wrong. We have to look closely when things go wrong and be honest with ourselves, as embarrassing as it can be. Because if we don't, we're really going to get ourselves in a bind. And so I finished my degree. I was a graduate student at Berkeley, but don't hold that against me. It's a good place. I took a job in Chicago and moved there for a couple of years and then moved to New York. And not long after, Sandy happened. So look, one message tonight is, be careful. If I ever wind up spending more time in the Bay Area, you might want to, invest in that retrofitting project that you've been putting off. So that's what Sandy looked like from above, as a massive storm, about 1,000 miles wide. It actually merged a couple of different storms. And unlike the heat wave, which didn't have an iconography, very quickly Sandy had an image that all of us came to know. I'm sure most of you saw this, a truly shocking image of New York City, where you see Manhattan and this incredible part of it that's so wealthy, the financial center of the world, where so many elites are concentrated, was just out of power for 6 days. And because what happened is that the peak wave from Sandy was 32 feet high, and the storm surge was about 14 and a half feet in places. And the electrical station that supplies Lower Manhattan with power had walls that were about 12 and a half feet high, because that was what they were planning for. Nothing that would come over would be higher than that. And then the equipment was down on the ground and not elevated. So as soon as the water breached over there, it was lights out. And what was shocking, and I lived in the area that we came to think of as south of power, SOPA. and so I lived there, and it was a very stressful thing. I had a 93-year-old father-in-law who was not mobile. He had no power on the 10th floor. It was across the street from where the power was. It was a very stressful and difficult situation. I had 2 young children. And if you lived in Lower Manhattan, I don't mean to be crude about this. I just want to be totally honest about the way that it feels to be in Lower Manhattan. Like, you don't feel invincible. I mean, we were close to September 11th, but you do feel like if the power is going to go out, it's going to go out in like the Bronx. So there's this idea that there's people who are governing the systems. This is what I'm trying to say. We have an idea that there's someone is governing these systems that we rely on for all the things that we do. And if push comes to shove, they're going to protect the most affluent industries, right? They're going to protect the financial heart of the world. They're going to protect the most affluent people. You're a political scientist, Margaret. That's what the theories tell us. They're not going to let Lower Manhattan go down. And what Sandy told us is that they actually don't have the capacity to do otherwise, that they too are powerless from this threat. It wasn't just Manhattan that went under. This is Long Island, the surrounding areas around Manhattan. You'll know in most parts of the country, we use this technology to provide electricity. It's called the pole. The pole, you've probably heard of the pole. And we have these electrical wires that go atop the pole, and then right above those poles with the electrical wires, we put trees with big branches, which we don't cut very often, and we are shocked when a hurricane comes and they go down, right? But we've built up an infrastructure that is, structurally vulnerable. And we've baked that infrastructure into our urban systems and our regional systems. And we're now at this moment where we have to rethink, how do these systems work? More than 8 million households lost power during Sandy, some for 3 weeks. And that means many more people. The subways filled up like bathtubs, right? Because when we built the subway system, we also didn't anticipate that the water would be this high, that the storm surge would come quite like this. And so it's not just that the stations are open, it's also, think about the times you've walked in the streets of New York City, that the air filtration systems are open and they're on sidewalks and streets everywhere, right? So as soon as the water comes in, the water goes everywhere. Now, what's staggering and disturbing about this image, if you know New York and you know what happened in Sandy, is it's 86th Street, and the flooding didn't happen up there. So think about how much water went into the system. Now, this is a terrifying story in some ways, but there's another part of the story that you should know as well. And that is that the city and the region took extreme weather seriously, and they happened to take climate change very seriously. They started that under Bloomberg, really. Now, you don't have to take climate change seriously to be prepared for extreme weather, but statistically speaking, there tends to be a relationship between those things these days. So what the city did and the Metropolitan Transit Authority did is they closed down the system, they removed the trains to higher ground, and they pulled the electrical wiring out of the system so that the corrosive water that would come in from the ocean and the river would not destroy the wires too, right? Because that could be major damage. And they were able to pump this water out. And so about 5 days after this, the system looked like this. The subway was up and running in almost all of New York City, which meant that while there was $60 billion of economic damage from this event, that's a lot less than it might have been. Now, across the river, there's a state called New Jersey. And in the state of New Jersey, there's a governor who's pretty skeptical about climate change and how serious it is, and pretty skeptical that it was worth spending a lot of time preparing for these kinds of emergency events. Now, this governor became a hero after Sandy for saying we have to do everything possible and we need to be bailed out, and for walking around with candidate Obama in 2012. But before the storm, this governor also oversaw a political system that said, let's throw the trains down close to the river, where $110 million of flooding damage happened to the system itself, which meant not just that taxpayers in New Jersey had to pay more, and nationally we did too because we bailed them out, but also that it took a lot longer to get the transit system up and running, which meant more economic damage and more headaches. Don't let me glorify New York City, because not long before Sandy happened, New York City also opened up a multi-billion-dollar train station right at the bottom of the Battery that was destroyed not long after. I put this up there because no matter what happens on November 8th, we are about to spend tens, hundreds of billions of dollars on infrastructure, big projects. Maybe not in the next 4 years, but in the next 20, 30 years. We are on the brink of the largest investment in infrastructure in generations. And we really have to think seriously about how we build and where we build and what kinds of systems we build. And if we don't take the climate seriously when we do this, we're going to make a lot of very expensive mistakes. I always show this slide because this is a scene from the NYU hospital. So these are my colleagues. By accident, the medical infrastructure of New York City in Manhattan is aligned along the East River, right in the flood zone. And the regulations told hospitals that they had to have backup power with generators, but they would really be better off keeping the fuel for their generators in the basement where it wouldn't get exposed to the open air and potentially create a toxic problem. And so when the floodwaters came in to NYU and to many other hospitals, they didn't just kind of flood out the data systems and destroy the computers and kill thousands of animals that were there for research. They also got mixed up with the fuel. And so it became impossible to go in there and repair things. So the power was out at NYU Hospital. It was in the midst of a hurricane. There was flooding outside. And this is the NICU. where there were many babies who needed to have assistance breathing. And my colleagues at the NYU hospital got paper bags and pumped with their hands air into the lungs of these babies and carried them down 8 floors together and evacuated them into a hurricane and put them into ambulances, which transported them through a hurricane up to hospitals that had power, and not a single person died. And the message for me is that if we create systems without thinking carefully, we need heroes to save us. But we don't need heroes quite as much if we create systems that work better. So there's a few different kinds of things that we can do as we start to rebuild cities and systems to reckon with this new climate that we're in. And one of the things we can do is we can defend ourselves. We can armor cities and regions where there's dense settlements. If you've been to London, maybe you've seen this. This is the Thames. This is a sea gate. It opens and closes. When the water is high, it closes. When it's ordinary time, it opens. There's a bunch of cities that you couldn't really have without gates or levees of some kind. We have New Orleans here. You probably know what's happening in Venice. London is like this. And so when Sandy hit, many engineers and prominent political officials said, we need to get one of those here. If you haven't been to New York recently, don't worry, this isn't here. That's right next to the Verrazano. But there's a live proposal to build a big sea gate across the water there, the Verrazano Narrows, going up, protecting the river system and New York Harbor. And it's a very attractive idea because if you see Manhattan there and Brooklyn behind it, you see a lot of kind of densely packed infrastructure. You see a lot of money. You see a lot of people. It's worth protecting that, probably. There's some places that we're going to have to find a way to protect. But the problem is if you build a giant gate, first of all, you're investing billions and billions of dollars. Second of all, I have trouble persuading my colleagues in Manhattan that this is true, but it turns out they're actually human beings around here on this side and over there, New Jersey and in other boroughs and up through Connecticut. And social scientists have worked enough with climate scientists to know that when the water and the sediment smashes into the gate, it doesn't just evaporate, it actually moves to the sides. And so it's actually quite in the business of people who live adjacent to big cities, to be concerned about what happens when you build gates like this. And we're a somewhat litigious society, I've read, and you could imagine that if you tried to build a gate like this, you would have a problem. It would be a tough thing. But there's another problem as well that's an ecological problem, and that is you would have to build a very, very high gate to deal with the rising sea levels that we expect. And the notion of these gates is that they have to be open most of the time. But if the sea level rises and it gets windy and you have storms, you find yourself in the situation where you have to close the gates more and more of the time. And as you close the gates, what you're doing is you're completely disrupting the entire ecosystem that lies behind it, right? And so it's a very consequential thing to do. There's another thing too, which is if you could close your eyes and picture the United States for a minute, it would be hard to wall off that whole thing, right? So where do you start and where do you end? If you're going to build gates of some kind and try to control the water and defend yourself, there are models that are worth paying attention to. I spent a bunch of time in Singapore recently. This is the Marina Barrage in Singapore, where they created a wall to control flows of water, but they have an infrastructure system which also doubles as a piece of social infrastructure. Remember that concept from my work on Chicago. It's got a park, a museum, there's a lot of green land there. They've used it to create an amenity that actually works for people and for tourists there every day, not just during crises. If you think about the Homeland Security projects that we did after September 11th that involved building these big barriers that might protect us from a similar kind of attack, but that certainly make everyday life a lot less pleasant. Think about the checkpoints and the bollards and all those things that we do now. We can't make that mistake in September 11th. And so Singapore is an interesting model of a place that tried to build a hard infrastructure to protect the city while at the same time creating an amenity that would have everyday benefits. If armoring ourselves is one thing we can do, another thing that we can do in the face of climate change is to retreat, to get away from the water, to maybe ask the government to buy us out of our homes or to move voluntarily out of places that we probably never should have inhabited. I'm guessing some of you read the New York Times today, where there's this big article about China's ecological migrants, right? And China's on the forefront of this movement of let's take a bunch of people. These are people who are living in a drought-struck area and move them collectively into a new place. China has an easier time doing that than we do in the United States because the government can just say, you're going. And it doesn't work as well here. According to this story, it's not working all that well there either. But we're facing a really serious set of challenges over the next several decades, where we will start to have places that have a lot of residents no longer be viable because of recurrent flooding. The storm that hit North Carolina and almost kind of hit Florida a few weeks ago, that was 40 miles away from Miami. And I know that Stanford is a little bit farther from San Francisco than that, but so Miami is there and working today because that storm kind of came through Stanford and not San Francisco, if you could think of that, right? And you have to wonder at some point, when do you not reinvest in the massively expensive infrastructure? That was a very politically difficult thing to say after New Orleans because of, after Katrina, because of the racial politics and the real politics of New Orleans. But we are about to have some real reckonings. And social scientists better have something to say about it. So another idea is that you can accommodate. You say, like the water is coming, or not, depending on where you are. But in places like this is an image from a plan for a floating city in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, where water engineering is the major export industry these days. And thankfully, because they've actually been able to help a lot of places. But what would it be like to say the water's coming and that we can't stop the water from getting in, so how are we going to live with water? And this is a fantastic idea, but this is a less fantastic, this is a real idea of, can we start to build parks that work as parks 360 days a year, but when there's massive flooding that comes in from big rainstorms, they get converted into water basins. They can capture water and divert the water underground so that we can live with water in some different way. And a lot of very smart people are thinking about how we live with the conditions that we've made. Now, there's some places that are going to be very hard to do any of these strategies in other than maybe retreat. This is the Rockaway Peninsula in kind of the Queens, at the edge of Brooklyn in New York. It's a barrier island. Barrier Island is a weird concept these days because our barrier islands are all densely populated islands these days. But remember, the concept of barrier islands is that they're there to protect the inlands where we had really settled, but we started to turn them into kind of, beach properties with little shacks, and over time they got built up. And by the way, the federal government in this country and the national government in many countries helped to subsidize that process. And we'll build a highway there, we'll build a bridge there, we'll build an infrastructure. Oh, by the way, we'll subsidize your flood insurance, and please come. So the Rockaways now is incredibly dense with lots of high-rise buildings, and that's what it looks like on a nice day. It's kind of an amazing urban place. It's got this gorgeous boardwalk, but that's what happened to the boardwalk in Sandy. When I went out there a few days after Sandy hit, that's what it looked like. And as I said before, our infrastructures fail. And when our infrastructures fail, what we rely on is our social infrastructure. And so in the Rockaways after Sandy, what happened is that there were these community organizations. This one is a surf club. That happened to have a strong footprint in the neighborhood where people really knew the residents around them, or people had strong connections. And when everything fell apart, people were able to reinvent these facilities and turn them into emergency relief centers, right? So imagine it's the hardest day of your life. You don't have power. You're worried about friends and family. You've maybe sustained major damage. That's probably not the time in your life when you want to go to a high school gym, right? And hang out for a while. But what happens is that these local organizations, community organizations that already have a footprint, that already have a presence, that have built-in relationships become really key for maintaining the health and vitality of communities. This is a youth organization in Red Hook, which also sustained massive flooding, that turned into this extraordinary relief center. Thousands of people, more than 10,000 people came there to give food, to volunteer services for plumbing, for electricity, for cleaning, to give clothes. I mean, these kinds of facilities happened popped up all over New York City, but they didn't pop up everywhere. And when survey researchers from NORC at the University of Chicago went out to look at what happened in New York City neighborhoods after Sandy, they found that the places that had the strongest social capital, the places where people had the tightest connections to their neighbors, they fared better and they recovered more quickly than the neighborhoods that didn't have that kind of social infrastructure. I had this incredible thing happen, which is that in September of 2012, I became the director of what's called the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. And I took it over and I said in September of 2012, we are going to focus here on cities and climate change. And we're going to do a lot of research and a lot of public programming on this area because it matters for New York City. It matters for everyone who's worried about the future. And the next month, Sandy hit. And I organized a group of faculty and graduate students. We created something we called the Superstorm Research Lab. We fanned out all over the city. We interviewed people all over the place. We generated maps. We did all kinds of classic Chicago-style field work to figure out what was happening in the city. I wrote an article in the New Yorker about what happened during Sandy, what other cities around the world were doing. And one day, kind of out of the nowhere, I got this email from someone saying they were from the federal government and they were about to do a multi-billion-dollar design competition to try to help rebuild after Sandy. They wanted to generate ideas for innovative structures and infrastructures, and would I be interested in being the research director and possibly even having the Institute be the host of this project. And it was something like April, and the project was going to start in June, and I was writing a book and raising 2 children and editing a journal and directing the center, and there was no time at all, and so I said, of course I'll do that. And so that started this Rebuild by Design competition, for which there were 148 teams from around the world, the biggest engineering firms and architecture firms and landscape architecture firms around, who competed to try to get into the competition. There were 10 finalists. They didn't compete with a project idea, with a proposal. They came as a team with a philosophy and an openness. They had to go through this 3-stage process that involved 3 months of research, looking into the region to try to understand various needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities for what could be built. That we had to do extensive civic participation. There could be no project that came from the top down, from designers who knew how to solve things for a community that they'd never spent time in. They had to have a collaborative process that involved really extensive work, painful work with all kinds of civic participants, from mayors and governors to church groups and civic community organizations. And then there was a 3-month design phase. So this was a 9-month process. I don't know where we got that idea that you could grow something in 9 months. But we did 9 months before we got final proposals. And then there was a juried competition. And 6 different teams won more than $1 billion in federal funding. And much more local and state funding to do some innovative projects. And what I want to do, just to kind of close out the talk, is I want to walk you through one of them, just so you can see what really good design ideas that come from a collaborative process that involves serious research that integrates social scientists and climate scientists and engineers and architects looks like. You probably remember this image from before, right? The Manhattan Without Power. So the project that's gotten the most attention so far is called the Big U. It's from an architecture team headed by the Danish architect Bjarke Ingels. Maybe some of you know him. He's a very prominent, leading contemporary architect. And they said, what if we could make a world where Sandy hits and Manhattan looks like this? Right? What could we do to make sure that happens without building that giant wall around New York Harbor that you saw before at the Narrows? There was real reason to do this. This is Tribeca. This is a garage outside of Tribeca. You probably know about Tribeca. It's like where the movie stars and TV stars live. It's a very affluent area. It's true that there's real inequalities when it comes to climate events, that the poor suffer more. But don't think for a second that if you have a lot of money, you can buy your way out of the problem. right? We're all vulnerable in different ways, and they clearly were vulnerable in Tribeca. So the Big U team thought about, like, well, what would it be like if we took the West Side Highway? Could you raise your hand if you've ever walked along the West Side Highway along the Hudson? Great, most of you have. So this doesn't exist here, this kind of wall right there, the park over there. What if we tried to build a wall around it, something like a wall to protect Lower Manhattan, but we're going to blow up the idea of a wall. We're going to create a wall that no one in their right mind would actually call a wall because it's going to look like something else. Like, it looks like some kind of park. It looks like a sculpture. It looks like an amenity that makes a kind of ugly place for cars that we've half-heartedly turned into a park, into a genuine park that will invite more people out to be in this very beautiful part of the city every day, and that will also keep the water from breaching the really vulnerable parts of the city every day, right? You know, it's funny, oftentimes I'll show this slide and people laugh, but actually it's not a joke. And if we lived in a different society, we might think, yeah, that's what design can do. We've waited such a long time to invest in infrastructure in this country. We take for granted that we'll have these impoverished structures that we think this is funny, but it's real. It wasn't just the affluent lower part of Lower Manhattan on the west side that was affected. This is the Lower East Side, which had its own catastrophic flooding. What I'm going to do is, so I live in New York most of the time and teach at NYU, and there's a bunch of us who drop our kids off for school in the morning, and there are a lot of runners. And I'm not one of the runners, you could probably tell from looking at me, but the runners all come in their clothes, and they always go west to the west side of Manhattan to run. You know, they're like, well, there's the East River too. You know, why don't you run on the East River? And this is why you don't run on the East River. If you wanted to take a run on the East, I'm going to burn a bunch of calories for you. You're now running on the East River on the Lower East Side. That is not a lovely run, right? That is not a lovely run. The fish market's now up in the Bronx, actually, but you could probably still smell it because it was there for a long time. It's also incredibly vulnerable. There's a lot of very poor people and very vulnerable public housing right behind this. The water came right through in Sandy. And so the Big U team said, okay, you know, we've got impervious structures, pavement here that just bounces the water off. What if we rebuilt the Lower East Side so that the landscape looked like this? You had these kind of bridging berms that kind of slowly sloped upwards and that blocked the stormwater from coming in. Potentially you cover the FDR, you know. Okay, that's a fantasy. That's not going to happen. But, you know, but you got to dream a little bit, right? So this is like this gorgeous idea for what it would be like to rebuild the Lower East Side. And, you know, here again, Margaret, tell me if I'm wrong, but the theories we have from political science and urban politics tell us that if there's a lot of federal money and local money and state money, and something's going to be done to dramatically improve a city that has this vulnerability, that it's probably going to be the Tribeca and Greenwich Village that's going to get that money, and it's not going to be the Lower East Side, right? Because we know who's got the power. But in this case, you know, when you have a mayor like de Blasio who's interested and concerned about inequality, when you have a president like Obama who recognizes this issue as well, it means that you channel resources in a different way. And the part of this Big U project that has been funded is the Lower East Side, where there's a thick concentration of poverty, not the Village and Tribeca, you know? And if you have friends in your life who are thinking on November 8th, it doesn't matter who I vote for. You know, it doesn't matter who I vote for. They all suck. In some ways, it really does matter. You know, there are certain ways where it really, really matters who's running a city and who's running a federal government. And they did the right thing in New York by making a principled commitment to protect the vulnerable people and places. But we don't always do that. But then this incredible thing came up, which is that we had this big consultative process with community organizations in the Lower East Side in the run-up to these designs that won. And they got this project that they had supported the whole time. And just as it was starting to come in and it seemed like, oh my God, this is going to be real, community leaders came to us and said, you know, we've already been gentrified. We've been gentrifying for the last few decades, and we all feel very uncomfortable here. Can you guarantee us that if you build that beautiful city, you build in that so beautiful infrastructure, that we get to enjoy it? Can you guarantee me, Eric, that if this comes through, after all the work we've done, that I'll get to live here, that my children will get to live here? And I could not look at them in the eye and say that I could promise that. And no one could. And that brings up another kind of problem where the climate scientists and the social scientists need to be working together to think about what it means to create a sustainable city that's not just sustainable ecologically, but also sustainable for people who live in it and make it home. So that's where I want to end. Because the real challenge here is, how do we do this next stage of building, of pro-building, right? We're not going to rebuild. We're now going to build in anticipation of what's coming. And how are we going to do it without creating a world that maybe is safer from some climate risks, but that brings with it a whole new set of inequalities that makes us worried about a whole other set of issues as well. I think these are the problems of our time. I don't see how any great university that wants to work in the social sciences, that wants to work in climate science, that wants to address this matter can function without squaring up and addressing it. And I truly hope that tonight is the beginning of a much bigger commitment from CASBIS, from Stanford, and from my university as well in New York to take this on. So thank you very much.
We only have about 10 minutes for questions, but I will let Eric take charge of that.
And I think we have microphones, and
Well, raise your hand and we'll pass them out.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I was wondering, it sounds to some extent from your presentation that a lot of the issue is a lack of awareness, that it's, enlightened city leaders, not enlightened city leaders. Can you talk more about, the gritty, incentives cities have not to do that? The sort of obstacles, the both ideological and economic interests, and all the reasons why these good designs are not getting done?
Well, it's an interesting question, and one thing is that it's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly expensive to do this, and we tend to do it after a disaster when you have to rebuild anyway. So why do we get to do this? Because there was at least $60 billion in damage from Sandy, because Congress, despite major objections from congressional officials who would later lobby for their own resources when their states got hit, because Congress finally passed a bill to provide relief to the areas that were affected by Sandy, and because we happen to have a fairly enlightened president and leader of HUD who had a commission that said we're going to carve out some special money to do these cool projects because we need to be forward thinking, okay? Imagine we don't have that. It's just politics as usual, and we're fighting to fund schools. And we're fighting to, pay for the people who work at the TSA checkpoints in the airport, right? And we have bridges to build and rebuild. This might rank very low on your list of priorities, right? Squaring up to climate change. And you might also know, if you're a smart political official, that if you just wait until something bad happens, there's a bunch of money that could come in. Right? So we have created a structure of governance that is necessarily backwards looking. We have failed to make the kind of progressive investment in structures and infrastructures that we're going to need to make it through the 21st century. Now look, I do think that's about to change. I think even if Trump were elected president and Nate Silver was completely wrong, right? The only idea that Trump has that seems serious is that we should invest in infrastructure. So, right, and I'm presuming that Clinton's going to win, and that she's going to take seriously this idea of creating an infrastructure bank and really making a bigger investment. And then we're going to put aside some X billions of dollars to start to rebuild cities. But can I also tell you that the amount of money that we would need to spend to protect not just Manhattan in all of its affluence, but also Miami and New Orleans and Mobile, and you just go up the coast and then come around to this coast. I mean, we are in for it. this is going to require a major investment. And if you're Chris and you've worked on the IPCC, you know that this is where it's easy, right? The really difficult thing is that we have these regions in the world, take Bangladesh, which is often the poster child for these situations, which are so vulnerable and have a much tighter time frame, and that have nothing like the kinds of resources that they need to build, and that have neighbors on either side that are not about to let millions of people in. Right? So there it's like, is the international community, whatever that means, I'm sorry about that, political scientists, you probably hate that concept, but will governments around the world find some way to provide meaningful funds for poor nations that didn't cause this problem to do something? I mean, right now the answer is no, but this is why I think we need to be owning this problem. I mean, this is why I'd like to see so much research being done here. And I just want to say one thing, because we're at CASBS, which has this special role in the history of the social sciences. The thing is that not only were these kind of environmental issues not part of social science from the get-go, but in the status order of the social sciences, what happened is that people who took on these kinds of problems were relegated to the periphery into the kind of low-tier institutions because these aren't serious problems. And so there's a disincentive for ordinary social scientists to take these things on. We really have to think about what we're going to do if we're going to be serious. Okay. I told you sometimes I preach. I didn't mean to do that, but yeah.
Eric, thanks for a great talk. I'm from New Orleans, and in the year after Katrina, I met with the dean of the School of Architecture at Yale and a bunch of urban planners, and I said, what do you need to rebuild New Orleans? And they said, you need dedicated local, state, and federal leadership. Your example showed what happened. You skipped over the governor. I assume the governor was supportive of this. But Mike, that's a long preamble to a question. New York had the trifecta of a mayor, a governor, and a president who were forward-thinking.
Yeah.
A lot of the action is going to be local and regional, as it was in New York. How does one encourage, foster, develop that kind of local, regional, forward-looking leadership? Because if we just leave it to happenstance, you may or may not get it. Louisiana is a great example where it was 0 for 3.
That's a great point. That's such a good point. And it's really the governor. I mean, your point in the American political system, the governor has an outsized amount of power. The mayors have very limited capacity to shape agendas. They have some funds. New York City mayor has some more than others, but you really need the governor because the programs go through states. And boy, I wish I knew the answer to it. Like when you hear Obama or Hillary say, I want people to make me do the right thing here. I can't just do it because I've got to fight against the fossil fuel industry, right, if I'm doing it on my own. There's a lot of vested stakeholders that would not like to make the kinds of investments that we're going to need to make. So we need to develop more of a common consciousness about this and to make it feel urgent. There's a mistake that I think a lot of us make when we think about this issue. We talk as if the problem is that Americans don't believe that climate change is real, or we don't think it's man-made. Can I tell you that that's not actually the problem? The majority of Americans think it's real. The majority of Republicans think it's real. The problem is that there's a bunch of really urgent issues that we face, right? We have unemployment, we have debt, we have to deal with a healthcare system that's too expensive, our schools are no good. So by the time you get through the list of things that really compel people to enter into politics and scream, that climate stuff feels very far down the list. It's just not urgent. Right? And this is a real problem. We're dealing with an issue that has a kind of geographical scale that makes it very difficult for us to address, that has a temporal scale that's challenging, right? Because it's not tomorrow's issue, it's not today's issue, it's some distant time. So we need to do some work to make it feel urgent. Mind you, if we make it feel too urgent, then people get scared and think it's hopeless and they can't do anything. Right? Please help with this, people. That's what I don't have the answers to this. What I know is this is a grisly, difficult problem. And clearly we don't get anywhere unless a lot of people start screaming.
Okay, right back here. Maybe one or two more?
Sure. And here's what, let's do this. Why don't we take a couple questions at a time and just to make sure that more of you get a chance to speak. Yeah.
All right. Well, first of all, and most importantly, we're down 2-0.
Don't tell me!
It's like, oh, sorry. Sorry. I don't know if you T-voted.
No, I shouldn't have done that. Okay.
All right. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Not over yet.
That's fine.
Thank you for your talk. It was fantastic. I have a lot to contribute. I'll try and
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I think I know about your contributions now. That's fine. I actually been checking, surreptitiously during the talk. So, sorry.
So I volunteer with the Red Cross, and during Hurricane Sandy, I was responsible for all Red Cross shelters open during the state of New York. And one of the interesting things about your talk, as I hear you, is, much of at least the response framework, right, and the political power necessary to respond to some of these challenges we did actually used to have in this country, right? I mean, the Red Cross is actually the agency that's sort of missing in your talk, right? And they were certainly missing on the feeding side in Sandy. But that was in a different era, how we as a community came together to respond to these issues and therefore drove political action towards responding to them. Personally, I think the response to your question that you pose here really is this isn't actually a political issue, it's an economic issue, right? That we have failed to provide the incentives in our system to respond to these challenges. And I'm kind of curious, I don't know, what your thoughts are on that.
Let's take another question also. So it's kind of a Red Cross and economic drivers. Yeah.
Hers, and then we'll take it.
That's great.
I'm going to pick up where you left off, which is to ask about the social activism, to say, where is the grassroots? Where is the concern? And I think my question is, in the academic institutions, are we fostering the curiosity? Are we asking the questions that we would like to be having the students ask, as opposed to, where is my next job? But what am I doing for society, and how am I reflecting on society?
You go to Berkeley, by the way?
So, excuse me?
It was a Berkeley question. No, I'm just kidding.
And I have a joke.
I'm
which
kidding.
Is, I want to do a shout out to your dad, because we both bike in Palo Alto at Klinenberg. I met him when we had both shown up at a public event, and we both showed up on bicycle, and I looked at him and I said, hey, we both bike here. So I biked up the hill to get here, and here's my joke. I almost got run over by a Tesla.
That's funny. Let's take one more question. Thanks. Yeah.
So my field is education writ large. Talk about marginal fields that we don't invest enough in. And I think a lot about lessons learned and the way we construct lessons learned. Yeah. And I think about your example of Chicago and Europe, and how we can capture from one learning experience to avoid another painful learning experience. And I look at those pictures of beautiful walls and parks being built in cities that can afford high technology, high capital projects. And I wonder, aren't we perhaps better off learning how to be really good at sandbags and hand pumps? And was there anyone who made a proposal like that?
That's really interesting. So
There's one more question. She's dying.
Okay.
All right, fourth, last one.
Okay, I just, all these,
You might have to remind me what the questions are. But
I just,
my best. Yeah. Okay.
I'm really puzzled that all these brilliant people like the Facebook and Google and all these high-tech firms are right next to the bay. So I just wondered what your comments about that was.
Yeah. Speaking of sandbags, right? Okay, so let's start with kind of there's NGOs and grassroots. How do we think about them, and then we'll do economy as well. There are a lot of Red Cross style. There's the Red Cross, and there are other actors that come into places that have been affected by disasters and do amazing work. Some are more kind of organized like military organizations. Some are more grassroots, like Occupy Sandy. And actually, the Superstorm Research Lab that I talked about, we went out and we looked really closely at how those systems developed, and maybe someone even talked to you. And many of them just kind of come and find a parking lot and a blank piece of space and just build a tent and open shop. I wonder how you'll view this, but what we've discovered is that the most successful interventions came when an outside agency like Red Cross partnered with neighborhood organizations like the ones I showed that already had ties, and they could be brokers to bring in resources from outside and deliver it to the networks that were already there internally, right? So that your capacity to be successful as the Red Cross hinges on the organizational capacities of the neighborhoods that you go to. Right? So there's a well-organized neighborhood that happens to have the kind of social infrastructure that I laid out is going to be much more successful at recovering. I think this is why the NORC researchers from Chicago discovered what they did. Then you would be, if you go to a place where kind of no one's home and you can't find the community leaders, right? That it really matters. So I think you're absolutely right to inject them into the conversation. Hopefully that kind of answers your question a little bit too. What's on the grassroots really matters. I mean, I want that to be clear. The social infrastructure is a core part of this talk. It's actually what I'm writing my next book about. You asked about the economic drivers for this as well. We talked a little bit about the costs of building new infrastructure. That comes up in this question, why build these in very expensive structures and not build more sandbags? But I also think there are economic opportunities here. There's obviously a whole conversation about a green economy or a Green New Deal, as some economists say we need to do. I think we have a lot of work to do, putting people to work, building structures that are going to be sustainable and meaningful. I don't think that we can just live with sandbags. I don't. I mean, I think there are some places where it's going to be hard to do much more. Like in Bangladesh, for instance, it's important to note that one of the most successful things they've been able to do is teach people to swim, and especially to teach women and children to swim. Because the water is going to come, and a reason that so many thousands of people flooded in previous major tropical storms and cyclones is because women didn't know how to swim and were left behind at home and had these caring responsibilities. So there's some work that's pretty inexpensive in that way that saves a lot of lives. And mind you, many of the solutions that I've talked about today, the social infrastructure, investing in social infrastructure is considerably less expensive than investing in hardline infrastructure systems. It really can do a lot of good. One of the things I've gotten really fascinated by recently are neighborhood libraries. I don't know how many of you have gone to neighborhood libraries recently, but if you're feeling down about the United States right now, just go to your neighborhood library for a day and watch who comes in there and look at the relationships that you see develop, from the tiny children who come in to be exposed to books and literacy for the first time, to homeless people and unemployed people who come in and use the computer or use the bathroom and do job search, to immigrants who come in to learn English as a second language or to study for citizenship tests, to older people who are there for companionship, to the waves of children who come in to do homework after school, to the cultural programming that happens at the end of the day. You will feel so proud of the fact that we have these neighborhood libraries in almost every community. And you will be amazed when you then go to your city's budget to see how little money we give them. That's not true universally. I've been to the new library in Palo Alto. It's an awesome facility. And I've been to the new one in Menlo Park, and it's great too. But those are outliers. We haven't invested in the cheap stuff, and the cheap stuff really matters too. Get your question, did I? Remind me what you asked. Sorry.
You did.
Oh, I got it. I think I got. Well, because I think. So the last thing I think. I think that there is something about affluence. It's kind of the New York story. I should put the slide of the Manhattan in the dark there again. There is something about our affluence and our success and our technological achievements that makes us feel like we can handle it. And I have had conversations with really serious people at Facebook and Google since I've gotten here, and I start to bring up the things I'm working on in climate change, and some are interested in them. Some say, let's not think about that. We're going to solve that problem. Let's think about what the Earth is going to be like 1,000 years from now. And I think, whoa, I'm not ready to make that jump. They might know stuff that I don't know. I'm a New Yorker, and I haven't quite figured out what this universe is like here. And maybe they've got something, Elon Musk has got it figured out. There's a vacuum cleaner that's going to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. That might be happening. Maybe it's happening at the Woods Institute right now. But absent that, I think 1,000 years might be, 900 some years too far in the future. I think we've got work to do now. So thank you very much.